So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here, and welcome to the first of three events in our Wellness Center series for parents and caregivers, you and your youth. My name is Rick Lodell, and I'm the manager of community projects and partnerships for Westminster Schools. Before we get started, I would like to recognize and acknowledge the Kakite First Nation as well as all Coast Salish peoples on whose traditional and unceded territories we live, we learn, we play, and we do our work. I'm proud to host you virtually at our newly opened Wellness Center at Westminster Secondary School. Our vision is to provide a community hub promoting healthy living through barrier-free access to services and support for students and families in New Westminster. For our presentation tonight, cameras and microphones will be turned off. We encourage you to utilize the chat function for questions. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Saira Sabzali is a registered clinical counselor with a PhD in transpersonal psychology. She is the clinical director of Dragonfly Wellness Centre, an online hub for mental health, personal growth, and counseling. She works with adults from diverse cultural backgrounds who are looking for a new approach to mental health. She specializes in depression, anxiety, family harmony, and burnout. Dr. Saira also runs support groups for women and newlyweds, has a free podcast, and provides teaching videos through Dragonfly Wellness TV on YouTube. And she is here with us tonight. So Dr. Saira, thank you very much, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to see the numbers going up as people kind of come into the room. And so while we're kind of getting all settled, what would be great is if you could tell me, how old is your teenager? So the one that you're thinking about when you come to this, you come to this setting, are you someone who works with groups of teenagers? Are you a parent? If you could type that in the chat box, because if we were all in a room together, I would just ask you to raise your hands, but we can't do that. So if you could tell me in the chat box, just give me a number. How old is the teenager that you're thinking of, or do you work with lots? So we've got 13, 15, 18. So we've got some parents, lots of parents here, 12-year-old parents coming, ready to learn for next year, 15-year-olds, 11. Okay, 15. So it's like the range. We've got all the way from 13 up to 18. We've got a 9-year-old, but working with high school students. Got it. 14, 18, 13. Great. So this is really helpful for me because then as I'm kind of giving you examples and kind of customizing it to what you need. If you have questions as we're going, I love questions. Please put them in the chat. So Rick and I are going to work together to make sure that I make sure to answer all of them. I might not answer it as soon as you type it in, but we will get to it by the end for sure. But we are going to keep it tight to the 1 hour. So let's get started. Here we go. So this is what we're doing today. We are looking at, it's a 3-part series. I don't know if you knew that, but this is one of 3 different presentations that we're going to be giving because there's just so much juicy content about teenagers and we couldn't fit it all in one. So this is just the first hour of it. And our first question that we're asking is this normal? And so our focus on today's presentation is going to be the teenage brain. So here we go. Our plan for today is I want to kind of look at 3 things. So first, I'm going to set the context of, what are we doing and where am I coming from and why are we talking about this? Next, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the teenage brain. And then we're going to look at how you can meaningfully support your teen, whether as it looks like mostly we have parents on the call, but also teachers and caregivers. And I have question marks all over here because, like I said, I love the chat. So please ask your questions in the chat. Make your comments in the chat. You can use those little reaction buttons too. If you have, if you say, yeah, I agree or whatever. Oh, I don't think we have reaction buttons for this. Anyway, forget that. Write it in the chat. Say yes or no, or what about this? So that we can make sure it feels more like a dialogue. So in the corner here, in the bottom left corner, you'll see a little guide. So if you're wondering, what does this slide have to do with anything, you can just look to the corner and you'll know which part of the presentation we're on. So I wanted to start with letting you know about the philosophical background I'm coming from. So I'm a registered clinical counselor, and I've trained in transpersonal psychology. So transpersonal psychology looks at the kind of the non-seen or the spiritual or the esoteric, as well as kind of mainstream Western psychology. So it's this blending point between the seen and the unseen in human experience. And the two important frameworks that I'm looking at are attachment and family systems. So let me explain to you a little bit about each one. So attachment. The attachment theory looks at the importance of a bond between a parent and a child. Okay, that to keep it really simple, that's what it is. And there's all kinds of there's like different parenting styles that have come out of that and all that. And I'm not going to talk about parenting style. I'm going to talk about the theory of what is attachment. So in attachment theory, the understanding is the most important thing in a family are the bonds between family members. And no matter what the kind of tools and resources and interventions we try, if there isn't a bond, nothing works. So we keep coming back to what is the relationship? What is the relationship? What is the relationship? And there's two particular researchers that kind of inform my approach. So Dr. Gordon Neufeld and Dr. Gabor Mate, and they wrote this book called "Hold On to Your Kids: Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers." That'll be our next session. But they're kind of really talking about attachment in modern context. How can we stay attached to our kids with technology and with friends and with all of the other things that are going on? So that's the first. And the second is a family systems approach. And so what that's looking at is understanding that every member of the family is absolutely an individual, but the family itself is also kind of an organism on its own, right? So any part of the system that changes creates change in the whole system. And so that's the two things that are informing this particular presentation, because there's so many different ways you can talk about teenagers. And I'll tell you, I've been having a lot of fun preparing for this presentation and reading all kinds of books. And honestly, there's like opposite information out there. So I was just looking at in the library the other day, and there's this book I came across that said, "Your children are your own fault." That's the name of the book. And it's a very like heavy-handed, it's a very different approach than what I'll be offering here. So some of what I talk about will totally align with what you're already doing, and some of it might sound strange to you if you're coming from a different perspective. But I would encourage you to just kind of keep an open mind, take it with a grain of salt, take a lightheartedness about it, and just know that there's lots and lots and lots and lots of different speakers you could have with different ways of doing this. This is just the way that I'm going to be doing it today. So let's get into it. Here we go. I want to start, and this is the part where you get to participate. This is the audience participation time, okay? So we're going to start with this idea of exploring the narrative. And so one of the philosophies in my counseling practice is what we call narrative therapy. And in narrative therapy, we look at what is the story that you're telling about your life? What is the story that you're telling about yourself? And if we look at those stories and observe those stories, what does that tell us about the potential for change? And when we look at something from a narrative perspective, we're saying that perspective and the way I see something is sometimes as important as what's actually happening. So if you look at these two pictures, here we've got the little children, and here we've got our youth. And so what I'm going to ask you to do now is write in the chat some words that you think of when I say the word child or children. What are some other words that come to mind? Type it in the chat. What are some words connected? Hear the word child, children. What else do you think of? Type it in the chat. Innocent. What else? Young, developing, emotional, pure, care, playful, blank slate, loving, precious, young, learning, playful, brat, beautiful. Right? So these are some of the words that connect when we think of child or children: inquisitive, moldable, right? Influential, angelic, fun. So these are kind of like distractible. I love that. Yeah, right. Learning. My love and war. I love that. Free. Okay. Open. Difficult. So most of our words that we're finding, like impulsive, loving, most of the words, if you look at the kind of ratio of the words that we're using, most of them are kind of like uplifting words, right? Might be a couple like difficult, brat, impulsive, a couple of those, but generally we have these kind of positive words when you think about the word child or children. Now, let's talk about the word teenager. When you hear the word teenager, What other words do you associate with that? Feisty. What else? Emotional. Angst, smart, determined, attitude, developing, scary, rebellious, independent, attitude, angry, have their own mind, moody, stubborn. What else? Explosive. Yeah, changes. Cranky, unpredictable, challenge, frustration, growing, invincible, or they feel like they're invincible, right? Indecisive. So look at the tone of our words, right? Rebellious. Look at the tone of our words, how they changed from like a child, so 0 to 12, to certainly 13 to 18 is like a whole different category of words. And I would like to challenge us on that. And this is how we're going to do it, okay? So I want you to think about yourself and something that you really value. You don't have to put in the chat. Just think of a quality that you really value about yourself. So mine might be honesty. That's something that's really important to me is honesty. Now think about a time in your life when you were a child, maybe the first time you kind of became aware of that value. Just kind of think about that. First time you became aware of that particular value. And so for me, the first time I became aware of that particular value, I have the memory so clearly. We were at the zoo, and my dad was one of the parent, volunteers. And we had been instructed, the parents had been instructed not to buy any treats for the kids. And my dad bought treats for everyone. And that was my first kind of rub with honesty, right? When the first time I became aware of that concept and became a bit uncomfortable with what was going on. Okay, so that was my experience. So think about your own experience. When was the first time you kind of had a rub or you kind of became aware of that value in you? Okay, now think of yourself as a teenager, so maybe 15, 16, and maybe ask yourself, did that value follow? Did that value follow you? So yes or no, type it in the chat. Type in Y or N. Did the value follow you into your teenage years? Yes, yes. People are saying yes, the value followed. Yes, yes, yes. Right, exactly. Right? Yes, 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 yes. And so isn't that interesting that we have all these words to describe teenagers that are kind of these like, fiery, feisty, all of that. And yet ourself, when you think of yourself as a teenager, you think, oh, I had this value actually translated to my teenage years. So what's going on here, right? It seems like we have a narrative, we have a story about what happens to children when they become teenagers. And if we're coming at it from that lens that it's going to be difficult, it's going to be stressful, they're going to be moody, it's going to be out of control, then there's a certain level of angst that we have as we're kind of entering the space, right, of the teenage realm. But what if that's just one perspective? What if there could be different teenagers, different kinds of teenagers, like maybe the kind of teenager that you were perhaps? Maybe you don't want your child to be that kind of a teenager, but like I was a pretty tame teenager. I was in leadership stuff, I volunteered, I had crushes, pretty tame, right? Maybe I was rude to my mom once or twice, but I wasn't any of those things that we listed. So that's something I wanted to start off with. Have us really thinking about what do we expect teenagers to be? There's these two young women that walk. In the morning I drop off my kid, my little one at the bus stop, and she takes the bus to school. And on the way back, there's all the teenagers come. Right? All the high school students are walking when I'm coming back. And the first little while, we just kind of all ignore each other, right? Because they're teenagers. And then I thought, wait a minute, these are someone's children. And now I smile and we nod and we say good morning every morning. And they're so pleasant. As soon as I smiled at them, they're smiling right back at me. But that story about like, oh, they're teenagers gets in our head. And we forget, like, these are someone's children. And 3 years ago, they were 7 or they were like 10 or whatever, right? 5 years ago, they were 10 and they were sweet. And so maybe there's some of that sweetness left. So let's use that as our foundation, okay, as we're going through. So I'm telling you this, and then I'm going to tell you how they go crazy when their brains change. So we'll get there. But that narrative and how we see and how we assume teenagers are going to be informs how we treat them. and informs what's acceptable to us and what's unacceptable to us as parents and teachers. Any thoughts about that? Type them in the chat as we're just building the context here. So this little girl, right? Maybe she's collaborative, and maybe she's collaborative too, but you might not expect that or know that just by looking at her and assuming what you assume about teenagers. So let's shift a little bit and think about the different life stages that children go through. So now we're starting to talk about their brains, right? What happens in their brain. So many of us, if we were to take a poll, we could probably say that we've seen our children change a lot, right? So if you think about infancy to toddlerhood, just that, from 9 months old to 18 months old, such a profound change in the child, from barely being able to sit up to now walking around and talking a little bit, right? We've watched our children change and change and change and change. And there's certain ingredients that are consistent throughout the lifespan of a child. And I would argue throughout the lifespan of a human, there's certain ingredients that are consistent. So those are bonding, being paid attention to, and having structure. Okay, bonding, attention, and structure. These primary ingredients are essential for children, for babies and children. But once they become teenagers, they're going to need a little more than that, right? So these are as important. So we forget sometimes that bonding is important, but you might notice sometimes your teenager wants to just come and get close to you or share something with you or cuddle up, and you're like, what? Suddenly you want a hug or something like that. It's that bonding is really, really important. Did you know that for optimal brain development, up until the age of 25, 25 years old, we need 2 meaningful hugs a day. 2 meaningful, connected hugs every day by somebody who genuinely cares about you in order for optimal brain development. Because remember, we're social mammals, right? We are designed to be in community. We're designed to bond. Without bonding, the tiger would eat us. So bonding is just foundational. Then there's attention, right? And you know as well as I do that if children can't get positive attention, they're going to find their way to get some sort of attention, and even if it's negative. And so children are seeking attention, and that's a normal thing. And the worst thing we can do is deny them attention when they're trying to seek attention. There's actually ways to give your child attention so they don't have to yearn for it in a particular way. And then structure, right? Kids need rules. They actually feel uncomfortable and insecure if we don't give them rules, if we don't give them boundaries, as well as teenagers, right? There needs to be structure, boundaries, and expectations with our teens as well. Just like adults, right? Think about if there's a time in your life where you had no structure, it feels like chaos. We need structure. We need to know that, okay, this is what to expect in my day, right? You can't have to totally do whatever you want. Maybe if you're on vacation, but even on vacation, we have a little bit of structure, right? So we need structure, we need attention, and we need bonding throughout our lives. So those are non-negotiables. When they become teenagers, suddenly there's all of these other things that come up that they need or that they're paying attention to. So they've got their friends, they've got school, and friends, I'll be clear here, friendships now are very different than friendships when you and I were growing up because they're in a virtual space a lot of the time, right? So there may be some face-to-face interaction, but possibly a bulk of your teenagers' friendships are through a digital space and through this other world, this virtual space. So that's something we have to kind of feel comfortable navigating as well. Dating, right? Or crushes, however exploratory your particular child is. Maybe they're just having crushes and that's all that they're getting to, or maybe they're dating. What are their interests? Where are they putting their attention? And then that question of identity, who am I? If I'm not a little baby, and if I'm not just an extension of my parents, who am I? So these are the different factors that the teenage brain has to consider now. Bonding, attention, and structure aren't enough. They need companionship. They need to be stimulated and interested, right? One of the things that I was reading, so there's this book for those who have boy teenagers. This is a great book. It's called The Male Brain. It's very eye-opening. And one of the things, there are many things, but one of the things that they talk about is the bored teenage boy, right? So that like, if you have a teenage boy, you know what I'm talking about, like this, that boredom. And what they were talking about is the male brain. So when the child's brain gets this flood of testosterone, in that formative time, suddenly they need a lot more to feel stimulated. So they're actually bored. They're actually not stimulated by the normal things that would stimulate you or me, or even would stimulate them when they were little. So that's why often teenage boys are drawn to things like horror movies, right, where it's very intense, or action movies, or video games, because there's like that, and there's stimulation. It's intense, and they can feel something. They can feel something because their brain is actually changing. One of the other things that happens around boredom in the teenage brain is the boy brain. As testosterone at about 13 or 14 years old, the brain starts sending messages to the facial muscles to not respond when emotionally activated. So a teenage boy can be feeling as intensely internally as a teenage girl, but they will not demonstrate that on their face because they can't biologically. And we think it has something to do with, in like the toughness and the alpha, and making sure that, in a community of men, to not look scared would be important, right? It would determine where you fit in the community of men. And so this is happening biologically for boys with testosterone in their brains, or this blood. Now, some of what I talk about is going to be gendered like that. So the female brain, the male brain, and they don't have enough research on transgendered kids, or transgendered kids. They don't have enough information on that for me to talk about that yet. But just think of it as a brain where there's a testosterone flush versus a brain where there's an estrogen flush. And individual boys and girls will be different. Okay, because the way that we raise them is different, their experiences are different. These are generalizations. So I just want to say that up front, that I'm aware that you can't like just put a blanket, but these are some of the things that might be helpful for you to know as you're parenting or teaching the boys, and we'll get to the girls as well. Someone says, OMG, I was bored from 13 to 18. Yeah, yeah. That's just, they feel bored. They're actually bored. They're not trying to act bored. I want to teach you something about what's happening in your child's brain or in your student's brain. And I like to use this idea of the captain and the first mate and the sheriff. And this is not my idea. I picked this up years ago. Somebody was giving a lecture on all these different neuroscience ideas, and he used the idea of a captain, and then I kind of rounded it up. So it's not just my idea. It's like pulled it from many places. But I found it was a really interesting way of understanding what's happening in your brain. So we're going to do this together, and you might feel silly doing it, but luckily your camera's not on, so nobody can see you. Okay, so do this with me. So take your two fingers and tap here in the middle of your head. It'll help you remember. So tap here in the middle of your head and say, this is my captain. Okay, this is my captain. This is my captain. And now here on the sides of your eyes, this is my first mate. This is my first mate. This is my first mate. And now at the back, right under that skull bump, right under that bump, tap there. This is my sheriff. This is the sheriff. This is the sheriff. Okay, so what does that mean? There's pretty much three basic areas in the brain. And we're not going to get into all the science of it. I want to keep it simple. So I like to say captain, first mate, and sheriff. The captain is the part of our brain that does long-term thinking, planning, strategizing, that knows how to be in social relationship, that can think things through, logic, problem solving. That's the captain. Captain can see the horizon and make decisions. The first mate is our limbic system. It's the part of our brain that's just wired for danger. Like it's watching and scanning for danger all the time. It's just looking like, where's the tiger? Where's the tiger? Where's the tiger? And in today's, in the way that we live today, there's no physical maybe tiger. So then somebody's dirty look becomes a tiger. Or somebody's three dots in the text message and they don't finish the text message becomes a tiger, right? Or an eye roll becomes a tiger. But That part is all, the first mate is always scanning for where's the tiger, where's the tiger. That's what it's designed for. And here's the thing. Depending on the first kind of 5 years of a child's life, the relationship between the first mate and the captain may be weak or strong. And the relationship between the first mate and the sheriff may be weak or strong. So when a child has had trauma, has had like kind of a difficult time, maybe there was a health issue, maybe there was, it was an intense household, maybe parents are unavailable, whatever. What happens is that the brain goes into survival mode. And survival mode means we pop into our fight or flight. We pop into sheriff regularly. And so what happens then is that the first mate sees something on the horizon that it thinks is a tiger, and it takes it to the sheriff and it says, here's a tiger. And the sheriff's like, shut her down, stay alive. We're fighting, we're flighting, we're doing we're doing the survival things, right? We're saying things we don't mean because that's fight, right? We're arguing with words that we would never use. That's fight. Alternatively, the first mate can go to the captain and say, hey, is this a tiger? And the captain can say, well, let me look at that. Let me investigate that and take a little bit of time. So here's the clincher. Are you ready? Children don't really have a captain until age 10. Yeah. So it's at age 10 that the synapses start connecting in the frontal cortex, in the captain. It's when we start thickening that part of our brain at age 10. So the first 10 years, if you're a parent, you're pretty much the captain for that child. If you're a teacher, you're the captain, right? That's why kids do some very silly things sometimes, little children, right? Like, didn't I tell you to put away your shoes and coat yesterday and the day before and the day before? There's no captain, right? There's also those rhythms and routines, those patterns haven't been picked up yet, okay? So our job as caregivers, as parents, as teachers, is to help strengthen the relationship between the first mate and the captain. Because up until now, the main relationship was between the first mate and the sheriff for many kids. So while all this flooding is happening of the different hormones, we're also trying to get them to make good choices, right? And not be impulsive. Who's impulsive? The sheriff is impulsive. Captain is not impulsive. Captain thinks things through. Captain sees the horizon. Sheriff just shuts it down and acts. So I wanted to share that with you because when you understand that it's their brain, like it's not always them, sometimes it's just a brain thing that's happening, it can sometimes be a little bit easier to not take it personally, right? And we see this, like, that typical image of like the teenage girl screaming at her parents. That's the sheriff. The sheriff has taken over. She's just trying to stay alive now by whatever means she can. Fight or flight. And there's two other ways to stay alive. And I don't want to get too much into the detail of it, but just for just a seed to drop in your mind. So fight or flight, there's also freeze and something else called fawn. Okay. So what fawn is where the person starts making everything better for someone else when things are going wrong. Like they start like caretaking other people. And you usually see that in households where there's violence or addiction or mental illness. There'll be the child trying to take care of everybody when they're stressed, when the child's stressed or other people are stressed, in a way that's not like healthy, in a way that's to their detriment. So that's what happens when the sheriff's in charge. We actually lose our mind. We lose the part of our mind that's making good choices. So hopefully that was an eye-opener for you. You might already know this, but hopefully it was something new. So let's talk about, now that you know kind of the different parts of the brain, or the, like, in a general way, let's talk about some of the changes that happen in the brain when these floods happen of testosterone and estrogen. So here on the left, that's what a child's brain looks like. I mean, not literally, but that's what it feels like inside the child's brain. It's like you're in the country and you're in a hammock and the breeze is blowing and the clouds are in the sky and it's just a warm sunny day and you're just kind of lying there, you're walking in the grass and it's just easy. That's the brain until about age 12. And then suddenly children are taken from this and they're plunged into this. They're plunged into like downtown, like the central New York City, right in the middle with all those flashing things. That's where they are suddenly, overnight. Sometimes it feels like. So where the inputs before were manageable and there wasn't much, right, stimulating the brain, now suddenly there's so much stimulation. Their attention is on so many different things that they didn't even notice before, like breasts. Who noticed breasts before? We were just playing video games. Now suddenly I'm looking at breasts and I didn't know that that was a thing, right? For for children who are interested in the female gender, it's like, oh, suddenly I'm noticing breasts. Or it could be that suddenly we're noticing social cues in a whole different way. Like suddenly you notice if you're an insider or an outsider, and there's all of this mean girl stuff that's happening, for example, right? So the child's brain suddenly just explode. It feels like an explosion, and so they're doing the best they can with what they've got. But when we know this is going on, we can kind of be a little bit more gentle, be a little bit more understanding of why they're acting so somebody said unpredictable, right? This is why it's unpredictable, because look at the kind of steps they're having to take here, right? In childhood, it was simple steps. It was like this to this, and everybody's kind of moving at the same pace. In the teenage years, suddenly they're complicated steps, because it's not just about what I want to do or what my parents want me to do. It's now I'm plotting that against what do my peers want me to do? What does society want me to do? What does my value system and my inner compass want me to do? Like all of these other things that are developing and building suddenly have an influence on which direction I go. And it's complicated. Like it's actually complicated for them to decide what shirt to wear in the morning. I remember I was thinking about it the other day. I had these three skirts, right? And I love them all. And it would be so hard to make a decision of which, first of all, I decided, okay, I'm wearing a skirt. And then I have to pick from one of these three. And it was a difficult thing when I was 15 to make that decision. It felt like a really important thing. Which skirt am I going to wear to school today? Nobody cared. But part of what happens in the teenage brain when they go through this change is that suddenly they feel like everybody's looking at them. They feel like everybody's noticing them and everybody's looking at them. And so there's this self-consciousness that develops in youth, because they're actually imagining that everybody's looking at them and caring about them. Yeah. So comment, my daughter asks me every day, what will I wear today? Right? So these are the things that are happening in their brain. And it happened with all of us, right? It happened with all of us. But when we were in it, we were just in it. I was just like, oh, it's hard to pick a skirt. But now as a parent looking at children, it's like, oh, that's why she's acting so unreasonably about can't finding that one pair of shoes that she wants to wear or whatever. I'm giving a really like trite example, but you kind of get what I'm saying, hopefully. I love this. My son just pointed out that the child's feet have 4 toes and the youth feet have 5 toes. We could make that mean something. Absolutely. I will in my next presentation. I will build that in somehow. But it's simpler, right? It's just simpler when you're little. It's simpler. I'd be interested to know, how old is your son? Is he 13, 15, 13? Yeah. So 13 is a really interesting age, because society now says you're a teenager now, so you get permission in a way to kind of shed some of that babyish stuff. And it's a weird 12 is a weird stage, because 12, 13, because you don't want to be with the little kids, right? You're not quite old enough to be with like the cool teenagers, so you're kind of in the middle. But you prefer to be with the cool teenagers or adults than little kids, because we're trying to push away from that, right? We're trying to disidentify with childhood and move into adulthood. Very astute observation for the 13-year-old. So that is what happens in their brains. I wanted to share this with you, that sometimes it can feel like an excuse, like, oh, hormones. Oh, here we go with the hormones. And it can feel like this like flippant thing that we talk about, but there's actually impact. And so it says here that it's testosterone and vasopressin that alter a boy's sense of reality. They actually alter their reality. In a similar fashion, estrogen and oxytocin change the way teenage girls perceive reality. The girls are primed for emotional connection and relationships. Okay, that's what oxytocin and estrogen do, is that they prime brain to seek out connection and relationships. When the boys' brains, what's happening is aggressive and territorial behaviors, marking their territory. So for girls, it's finding the group, right? Getting into the circle. And for boys, it's figuring out where I am on the ladder. This is really, really important to understand if you have And again, not every boy, not every girl, but in general, for female brains, it's about who's in the circle and who's not in the circle. And so, and even as adult women, right? Who's in the circle and who's not in the circle. And for the male brain, it's where do you fit on the totem pole? Where do you fit on the ladder? What's your position? So it's just a different way of seeing the world. Like it's qualitatively different because the kinds of things that you do to get into the circle are different than the kinds of things you do to get to the top of the ladder. Different things. Different things are needed. So I'm going to pause here for a moment. I've given you a lot of information. Just want to pause to see if there's any questions that you're having as you're kind of taking in some of this content before I move to the next part about how to support them. Any questions? If you don't have a question, I'd be really interested to know, is there anything new that you've learned so far? Put in the chat if there's something that you weren't aware of before that, oh, or something that you kind of knew, but you got reminded like, oh yeah, I need to remember that. Type it in the chat. Is there something surprising, something new so far? Fawn. Yeah, that's a good one, right? Can you please write the name of the books that you recommend? Sure. Let's do that at the end. Maybe Rick can help me out with that. We can write down the names of the books. The Captain. No captain until the end. Right. No captain. Or at least it's like very much sleeping most of the time. Okay, so we'll move to the last part, which is around support, right? Meaningful support. Oh, what a good question. If the male brains are primed for aggression, how can we support safe social connections? In a word, sports. In a word. So you create opportunities to have competition that's safe, that's culturally sanctioned. And for teen boys, something happens in the teenage boy body where they suddenly need to move more. Like they suddenly like have all this energy, they need to move. So that's then this follow-up question. If your child can't do sports for physical issues, that is a really good question. I'm wondering if there's any kind of physical movement that's possible. If there is, I wouldn't know how to answer that. Like some sort of movement because testosterone requires movement. We need to be able to move, but if you're not physically able to move, I'm not sure the body will probably compensate in some way. So I'm not sure about that. If they can't do sports for physical, and maybe it's not sports, organized sports. Maybe it's running on your own, right? Maybe it's badminton with your dad. Like it doesn't have to be necessarily a group of people playing. It could just be a small. Okay, so some really good questions coming in here. I'm just going to take a couple of these. When do boys and girls shift from teenage to adulthood? What a great question. So the brain keeps developing until about the age of 24, 25 is when like brain development is kind of complete. You know, and people in the field kind of wonder then about like the legal drinking age because it's affecting your synaptic development. It's affecting your brain development when you're drinking after like in those 18 to 25 is a very crucial time. So I guess it depends on how you define adulthood, right? So if you're talking about the completed brain, like when the brain is kind of set, it'd be 25. If you're talking about maturity and what people are capable of, some teenagers at 19 or 20 are extremely mature and ready to take on adult responsibilities, right? Some 30-year-olds are not. So I think you'd have to think about how are we defining adulthood and for what purpose is that? But that's how I would answer that one. What if your child doesn't want to do sports? This is a really good one. So if your child is a male and doesn't want to move, then he's going to have a really hard time in his teenage years. Get him moving somehow, family walk, or send him on errands to go do like something. Because what's happened right now, because of the immersion in screens, kids aren't moving. Like all kids are not moving as much as they should be. So movement is really going to help. And I would say like just find ways to trick them, like Like just find ways to trick them. One of the ways I'm tricking my son is like, hey, can you walk with me to and just like tricking him along, or can you take the dog for a walk, or just trying to trick them to get them out, get them moving, get them moving. And one of the things that I'm actually giving a presentation on parenting for little ones next week. And one of the things I talk about there is how important it is to participate with your children in activities. So often we want to like send our kids off to go play or to go entertain themselves or go do something. And we don't like, we kind of like, you go do your thing. I need my time or my space. If you can get involved with them in a way that's not going to like embarrass them in front of their peers, so privately, do things with them, they're more likely to do things. So if the whole family is going for a hike, for example, they're more likely to come along. If everybody's going swimming, they might hang out at the side of the pool and look really super bored, but maybe they eventually jump in and maybe they eventually start having a little bit of fun, right? Because remember, a lot of this time is about posturing and peers. Like, what are the peers seeing and thinking, and everybody's looking at me, and what are they seeing? So there's a lot of management that's going on, and so we want to give our kids chances to get away from that and just be free and physical. Free and physical. Our son likes to walk. Yeah. Is competition in video games a way to express that aggression healthily? Yes, yes. So video games can be really, I know in the past there was all of this hate on gaming, but the research is showing it's actually, I mean, there's extremes, like there's play, you know, if your child is never doing anything but video games, it's a problem, but video games can be a great outlet for some of that aggressive and some of that competition type of energy. Absolutely, yes. And again, like I was just talking to my husband and saying like, you guys need to play some Madden because they're not going to play. My child is not a football player. He's a bookworm, but he's getting Madden, right? He's getting something where there's that movement and that excitement, and he's doing it with his dad, right? For now, let's see how long that lasts. What else? How can I help them to like homework, like enjoy doing homework during these years? See, if the child is interested in the topic, in the subject, they're probably more interested in the homework. A lot of the homework is just busy work, in my opinion. Like, sorry for all the teachers on the call, but I mean, you can achieve in the classroom a lot. And some of it is practice, like some of it is certain things you just have to practice and practice and practice to get the concepts. And so maybe having some sort of like an incentive, like how do you do it, right? Think about yourself as an adult. How do you get yourself to do the things you hate doing? Use that strategy with your kids. Teach your kids that strategy, those strategies. I know one of the things I do is I like washing dishes, don't love it. Put on a podcast, put on some music, right? And that helps me get through washing dishes. Writing notes, hate it. What do? I tell myself, okay, when I'm done these notes, I'm going to go and call a friend, right? And so I reward myself for getting through. There's different strategies that you're already using in your life. Introduce these to your teens. This is the time that they could actually use those strategies. Is it okay to share the tough times with the teenagers? That's a really good question. I'm going to come back to that one. Okay, I'm going to come back to that question. My 12-year-old loves to play Battleship and Monopoly with his dad. These end up being intense games, right? Because that competition is starting, and maybe even wait till he's 15, right? That'll be even more. Okay, thanks for these great questions. I want to make sure that we get through to the part about supporting your teenagers. So I have these two images, right? So often the teenage years can feel like this unknown path that they're expected to walk down, and there's all of these struggles and difficulties along the way. That's how a lot of teenagers see their teenage years. But I wanted to show you a different image. I want to show you this image, which is here's the teenager, and here's the person they're becoming, right? That adult that they're forming into. So there's a path, and the path is not straight, right? The path is curvy and it's round, and sometimes it takes a couple steps back, but we're moving to become the person who you're flourishing into something, right? You're moving towards your better self, your older self. Along the way, parents have to hold these particular signposts, not only these, but especially these. Trust. Trust, trust, trust. I have all these resources and I should write them down. Brene Brown. Can you make a note, Rick? Brene Brown. Brene Brown has this short talk on the anatomy of trust and the different components of trust. worth the watch, because it really breaks it down, like what are the different pieces of trust, and as an adult, as a parent, what am I offering my child, and where am I maybe not so good at that, and where has trust been broken, how do we repair it? So trust is number one, and teenagers talk about this, like my parents don't trust me, and it upsets them because they're assuming I'm doing what everybody else is doing, right? So trust, support, right, being the place for them to land, and always asking, even if you get a cold shoulder, even if you get an eye roll, always asking, and letting them know that you're there when the time is right. Teenagers will often show up at the most inconvenient times for a deep conversation. You just need to drop everything and just be there when they show up for that conversation. So support, presence, you just physically being around physically helps. And this is counterintuitive because we think that when they're this age, like we can leave them alone more, right? But what the research has found is that teenagers who have parents who are kind of hovering a lot of the time around the house tend to take less risk-taking behaviors, right? Because there's another set of eyes. It's simple. So presence, and not presence like a hawk, like like, oh, I'm gonna, but just your presence, your gentle, open, relaxed presence, and then guidance when they ask for it. Because if you do these, trust, support, and presence, they will come to you for guidance. They actually will, because they know that there's not going to be that anchor, that thing coming down on them. How do you trust your teenager when they don't demonstrate you can be trusted? That's I'm going to give you that resource for the video. Watch the video. You'll get some good ideas from that one. How do you build? Because trust is a big concept, and so she really breaks it down. Like what trust was broken? Was it about boundaries? Was it about integrity? Was it about judgment? Like what was the piece? And then you can have that conversation that, I've noticed that you don't follow through, but you say you're going to do something and you don't follow through, and that breaks trust. And so I want to trust you. And so how can we fix this? Ask them. I don't know how to fix it. Well, let me know what you come up with, because I really want to be able to trust you more. And then let it percolate. It might take a week, but let it percolate. Okay. Now here's the part, ladies and gentlemen, is parents of teenagers are not often encouraged to support themselves because they're busy. They're busy driving their kids around everywhere, right? I mean, maybe with the last couple of years it's been less, but you're invested and you're busy. So making sure that you're role modeling what it looks like to support yourself, that you're role modeling what it looks like to support yourself. Kids are going to do what you do. They're not going to do what you say. I'm going to say that again. Kids are going to do what you do. They're not going to do what you say. When my kids were little, like 4 and 2, whatever, 4 and 1, there's this picture that I posted of them like reading little books on their own. And I had a friend reach out to me and say, how do I make my kids into readers? They're 9 and 11 and they really hate reading. And so I said to her, well, do you like reading? And she said, no. Like, okay, well, there's the problem, right? Like they're going to do what you do. They're not going to do what you say. So if you're looking after yourself, if you're demonstrating healthy ways to look after yourself, it's more likely that they will do the same, because that will be role modeled. And we sometimes as parents don't, and teachers too. I work with teachers a lot, and don't do what we need to do to have our cup full, right? We don't. We forget because we're busy. So, and we choose to watch Netflix rather than like do that meditation or whatever it is that, fills us up. We forget, we get busy. So supporting yourself is a key ingredient. It actually is. And in family systems work, we talk about how it's usually the parents that are the problem. Sorry, but it usually is. And people who work with teenagers, like therapists that work with teenagers, will tell you that the teenagers are acting out something that's happening that's unhappy at home. So if you're in a relationship with a partner, then, and that's not okay, your kids will feel it and they'll act it out, even if you're trying to hide it behind closed doors, right? So getting your own house in order, your own inner house in order, is going to make a huge difference for your kids. Huge. Please don't underestimate that. It's really, really important. And so I want to teach you this before we close. Okay. So remember we talked about the captain, the first mate, and the sheriff. So one of the things that fuels fires is when the adult is in their sheriff brain. Okay. So This is a technique that you might want to use when you're dealing with unreasonable requests, when you're dealing with attitude, when you're dealing with non-compliance, right? All of these things. So this is the process. So first, you want to review. You want to take a step back. You want to remove yourself. Take a step back and actually look at the situation. What is actually happening in this situation? What are they actually asking me for? What are they saying? What are the words they're using? Are the words they're using actually what? Because sometimes they'll say something and what they're really saying is, I miss you, right? But they're using different words. So review all of the evidence, like kind of sit back and see what's going on. The next step is reflect, to actually look at yourself in the mirror, because teenagers know how to press our buttons. They know where our vulnerability, I mean, kids in general, but especially teenagers, because they're getting savvy, right? They're learning how to work in that adult world, and they're pushing. They're seeing like, how far can I push? So when you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, why am I taking this so personally? Oh, because she made it personal. Okay, okay. She called me unreasonable, and that got under my skin. What's that about? Right? And so getting reflective onto why these particular things are getting under your skin. Because you might have noticed sometimes you're fine and you can totally handle it. And other times you just can't even take one more second. And that's usually because of what's happening for you internally. So once you review all of the evidence, then you reflect what's happening for me, in me at this moment, and get yourself back to captain. Do not make punishments or consequences unless you're in your captain, because then you'll regret it later. You'll be punishing yourself, right? Like, nobody can do any of this weekend, and you think, oh no, like I wanted to do that. So reflect, stop, review, reflect, and then respond. And I put this picture up because this is the opposite of what we should be doing. Okay, we should not be on our high horse on our podium and talking down at them. So we want to respond from a place of problem solving. How can we do this? What are your ideas of how to get through this? What do you think we should do here? If you were the mom, what would you do right now? If you were the mom, or if you were the dad, or if you were the teacher, if you were the teacher and this was happening, how would you handle it? What would you do? What am I missing here? Get curious. They're actually wanting to be asked. Like, they really are. I've been reading all these teenager books, right, for years. And especially over the last few weeks preparing for this presentation. And my son keeps saying, he's like, but why aren't you just asking teenagers? Why are you reading books written by adults? Ask the teenagers. They know what they need. And it's true, right? Like, and I know that Rick was talking about like surveying kids and actually getting their input on what it is that they want. And we forget to do that because I think honestly, we've forgotten what it feels to be that age. We've just kind of like got old and grumpy and crusty. We've forgotten that life can be interesting and lighthearted and goofy and intense the way it is for them right now. I'm going to put this back on for you. Review, reflect, respond. Review, reflect, respond. Any questions about this piece or anything else that we've talked about so far? There was a question I said I'd come back to. Oh, yes. Is it okay to share the tough times with the teenagers? So I would use the review, reflect, respond for that and say, okay, what is the tough time about? So one of the things we want to be really, really careful about is not bringing children into the intimate partnership. So if there's a relationship between parents, whether you're in a romantic relationship or you're separated in different houses, doesn't matter, but you're the co-parents, whatever happens this way should not filter this way. So you don't want to be confiding in your children about your spouse or your ex-spouse. That's really important because kids will feel so torn. They'll feel so torn because they want both. They want both of you. Even if one of you is a jerk, they still want both of you. And so when you're feeding information to a child about the other parent, it puts children in a really, really tough spot, like a really tough spot. So that's really important that you not, if the tough times are about your marriage, talk to a counselor, talk to a friend, talk to another adult. Don't talk to your kids about that. Unless it's like, okay, we're deciding, like we're coming together to you and we're talking to you as a team. Don't go just one person and badmouth the other person. So important. Or badmouth another child in the family. We call that triangulating, right? So something's between me and the other person, let it remain me and the other person. Don't bring in a third party so that there's now teams and people have to pick sides. That's really important. Really important. Oh, what a good question. Okay. You talked about how if there's conflict in the home or the parent is unhappy or there's some kind of struggle, the teen will pick up on it and be reactive. What do you do? Life isn't always smooth. What an excellent question. I would say give them what's the word? The courtesy of talking about it. And maybe not in much detail, but you can say things like, I'm having a really rough day and I'm sorry if I'm being grumpy right now. And I don't mean to take it out on you, right? Or some event happens in the family. Say there's a death in the family, right? That this must be really hard for you right now as this thing is going on. So you're voicing it. You're bringing awareness and consciousness to the fact that things are hard right now, and we're all suffering and struggling. And how are you doing? And is there anything I can do to support you? Right. So that's the presence piece, right? Showing up and being available, even in your own stuff, being able to kind of like for a minute, box it, put it on the side, and be the grown up for a minute. And then you can go back and do what you need to do, right? But showing up as a grown up for our kids is so challenging all through their years, but especially in their teenage years. So yeah, life is not always smooth. And I think it's important, especially as they get to this age where they can be problem solvers. They can actually help generate ideas of how to move through this as a family. You'd be surprised at some of the things that they come up with. So yeah, of course things are going to go and the child might be acting out. So call it, talk about it. And if they don't want to talk about it, then you can say, well, you don't have to talk about it with me, but can you talk about it with someone? Who are you talking about it with? Auntie, your friend, your teacher, whoever. Okay. So I see a couple of more. Oh no, that's all the questions, right? Have I missed anything?
I've got two here, Dr. Cyrus. So the first is, how do we bring structure in the home if your kids are already in their teenage years?
Yes. Okay. That's a really good question. How do I bring structure in my home? My kids, because some of this is cumulative, right? Some of it we should have started like in infancy and toddlerhood. But if they're teenagers now and you're waking up and saying, "Uh-oh, we're in trouble," I would say that's a hard one. The thing that has helped a lot of people in my practice is looking for mentors. So looking for other families that you look up to who are parenting their kids in a way that you like, that you want to emulate, and building community around this. Because one of the mistakes that we've made is that we thought that, two adults are supposed to raise children and that's it, and nobody else gets involved. Like that's not how we were ever designed. So I would say reach out in your circle, look around and see, are there other people doing this the way I want to be doing this? And if not, come to things like this, come get ideas. A lot of it is going to have to be the review, reflect, respond, your own inner work and your own self-care, and saying to them, I'm going to try something new. And it might feel really strange because we've never done this before, but I was thinking maybe we'll have a family meal twice a week and we're all going to sit down and try it just as an experiment, right? And you ease in some of those structures, you ease in some of those moments of connection. And hopefully you keep coming to these because there's other topics that will address some of that as well.
And then, Dr. Sarah, earlier in your presentation, we were going to mention the books that you mentioned at the beginning. So I know one was The Male Brain. Do you remember what the other one was?
Yes. So there's The Male Brain. There's also a book by the same author called The Female Brain, which is, so for those who have, my sisters borrowed my copy. I couldn't find it, but there's another one. So, and they're really, really interesting. So yeah, that's another one. Another resource for girls is this book, Untangled: Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood. There's some parts of this book that are not really like in my way of thinking, because there's a lot of peer focus, and I'm going to talk about it in our next presentation about peer orientation. So aside from that, I really like this book. So Untangled. Okay, for girls, The Male Brain or The Female Brain for both. And then if you want to know more about attachment and that kind of parenting, Hold On to Your Kids: Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. We'll talk more about this book in my next presentation in the series.
Great. And Dr. Sarah, you mentioned Brene Brown and trust. Is that something you'd like to touch on in your next session?
No, just people need to go
Okay.
watch the video. Yeah, it's called
Okay.
Anatomy. The video is called Anatomy of Trust. So
Great.
if you go into YouTube, Anatomy of Trust, Brene Brown, you'll catch it there. She explains it way better than I can. So
Wonderful. Well, all I can say is wow. Thank you, Dr. Syra, for the engaging and thought provoking presentation. I'm already excited for our next session. For those of you who registered on Eventbrite, all registered attendees will be emailed with a new invitation for our next session on April 7th, entitled Keeping Your Teen Connected to the Family. Lastly, I would like to thank each and every one of you for attending tonight's presentation. I recognize how challenging it is to kind of make this time. We really, again, appreciate just how much you would like to put into the learnings for your family and for your teen. I hope you can take some learnings from tonight and give your teenager those 2 hugs per day. And we've also recorded tonight's presentation, and it will be posted on Dr. Syra's YouTube channel, Dragonfly Wellness TV, and we will also share that on our website. Dr. Syra, is that correct? Okay, perfect. So, yeah, in the meantime, again, I expect a new email Eventbrite link from myself with a new Zoom link. Thank you all again very, very much for being here, and stay safe, have a wonderful spring break, and take care. Good night.